All right, what's going on? Sean, Adrian, you guys here?
Yes.
I am.
All right, cool. So this is the Curse Discussions podcast. At least that's what we're calling it right now. My name is Chucky Arlaw. So with me are Adrian Shepard, Sean Last. Today we're going to be discussing
Donald J. Trump.
So, what do you guys think about Blumpf? How do you guys think he will be seen? First of all, before we talk about what we personally think about Blumpf in terms of how good or bad he was relative to other presidents, how do you think that he will be seen historically by normies, essentially, like in the future?
Well, I think that the first thing that comes to mind there is that that's going to depend. I mean, it'll depend on many things, but one of the things that's going to depend upon is the trajectory of immigration politics in the United States. I think because that's probably that and trade, both of which are sort of nativist populisty things, are the ways in which he is a departure, the biggest ways in which he's a departure from traditional republicanism. And so if that continues to be something that grows in the Republican Party, then I think historically he'll be seen as a pivot point for the Republicans. If on the other hand, right, they just sort of recede back into John McCain-ism or George Bush-ism or something like that, or something new that's not either of those things, Ted Cruz-ism, then he'll probably be seen as a weirdo and probably not looked at very favorably, I would imagine.
Women will see him as a pedophile, would you say?
That is one way of expressing that, sure.
Just grab him by the pussy.
Oh yeah, I mean he wants to grab him. So
actually, if I could just build on that, I think Sean has a good point. It definitely depends on future generations, obviously, as you know, all legacies do. But another thing to keep in mind about the immigration policy in respect to his legacy, if, as you know, may or may not happen, the U.S. becomes majority non-white, or super majority non-white, I think he'll definitely be seen as a villain of history. And this could happen in a couple decades. I figure the Republican Party will probably jettison Donald Trump, even if other later Republican candidates and politicians use his nativist anti-immigration rhetoric. They'll probably jettison him at the point where it is basically politically inconceivable to want to reduce immigration. So I think it is extremely contingent in that case on the future of the U.S. in a couple decades, 2030, 2040, 2050.
Whereas, so if Ben Garrison became, president in 2020, then Trump would be looked at as like a moderate who wasn't quite there.
A cuck, yeah.
Yeah.
So I think there are two comments I have about that. One is that even if the U.S. becomes majority non-white, it could be the case that he's viewed in a very polarized way, which I guess he is now already, but even more so where the white people see him as someone who tried to stop it from happening, whereas the non-white people obviously wouldn't. But also it's worth mentioning that if he's viewed as someone who opposes Hispanic immigration and sort of gave power to that trend in the United States, a funny thing could happen whereby, say that one possibility, whites in the future formed a coalition with Asians because they had similar socioeconomic interests, and both groups really didn't like Hispanic immigrants. That could lead to a funny perception of him, where Asians and white people would view him favorably, and Hispanics and black people would be quite upset by him. In retrospect,
Asians already like Trump. Donald Trump.
Well, I don't know about that, but well,
I mean, they didn't vote for him.
That's true. Although to be fair, most
that's
most
kind of a
Asians
weird thing, right? If I remember looking at the Pew stuff, you can break down different Asian groups how they voted, and normally I think the Hmong people are super Republican. They might have been a little bit less. Here, actually, I'm gonna look that up. Do you guys know what I'm talking about? The stats on that?
Yeah, the Vietnamese traditionally vote Republican, but I believe they did not vote for Trump, if I remember correctly, which is abnormal for
especially since he didn't mass murder them like John McCain.
Well, yeah, I mean, he specifically went out of his way to avoid mass murdering them because he's a draft dodger.
Exactly, he's a hero.
Yeah, well, that's what's kind of weird is that boomers didn't really see him as a Muslim because of that.
That was wild. Like people, yeah, that was one of the like very strange parts of the presidential campaign in 2016. People literally thought that's the end. That's, oh, it was funny that Trump ran, but yeah, this is where he went too far.
Oh, you think people thought it was the end when he was exposed to a draft dodger?
I remember very clearly several talking heads saying that. Yes.
Oh,
I mean, yeah, a lot of low IQ talking heads.
Well, talking heads, yeah.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing, I mean, I think this shouldn't be too controversial to say, is that like it was the grab him by the pussy thing, right?
I mean, that was certainly. I mean, okay, that
Especially
was very
because,
late.
like Christ fags, right?
No, yeah, I get.
That's a big deal for them.
Certainly, that was a big deal, or it was, supposed to have been a big deal.
I almost feel like this could be a turning point in terms of like the secularization of the Republican Party, the secularization of conservatism, or I don't even know if you could call it conservatism anymore, but just whatever, not the left.
I mean, I would almost conceptualize it less as a turning point, so much as we are seeing the end of that awkward, and I would describe it as negative period in which evangelicals sort of captured a huge part of the Republican Party.
I think it should be said though, no Republican since God, you'd have to go really far back. I can't even think off the top of my head of someone who was a real devout Christian who maybe Bob Dole. But probably not.
Well, didn't Bush have that whole thing where he was like, he was degenerate and then he found the light or whatever?
He had a good narrative, but it was so obvious.
Oh yeah, I don't think that was real.
Yeah. I mean, but you did have religious zealots in American politics before William Jennings Bryan, for example. But the Republican Party has like played it with like these slimy. I would say Jimmy Carter was probably, to start with the Jimmy Carter shilling, but he was probably more of a devout Christian than any Republican president since him.
And
it's like so jarring, and it's so obvious too.
Well, wait a minute. Are you talking about in terms of how he presented, or in terms of like what he really believed?
Both. I mean, yeah. He was very earnestly and openly Christian in a way. I don't think anyone like Reagan may have presented very strongly as one, but it was so obvious. Like this guy was from fucking California. He was from California.
He was like California in an anti-traditionalist way, right? Like if I remember correctly, he was the first state governor to pass no-fault divorce.
California values.
Yeah, exactly. California values, exactly. Like obviously, I would say probably Ted Cruz. Is the last hurrah, or maybe the last hurrah of like real conservatives having like a real chance at the White House, or like the real religious right putting someone who represents them in the White House. I mean, we'll see for 2020, but like I think.
Well, obviously not in 2020 because that's going to be Trump for the Republicans in 2020.
No, because Blumpf is going to be impeached because like a Russian whore like peed on him or something.
I mean, okay. To be fair, a president can be primaries and has been before. So
that's not going to happen.
Yeah, John Kasich, the mailman.
Although, if Trump was impeached, then it would be Pence, and he is quite evangelical.
That's true. Although he's very strange, isn't he?
Yes, just in general.
He's a quote unquote evangelical Catholic.
Yeah, that's Marco Rubio was kind of similar. He had that little clash of identity there, right? Where he was like, I think he went to like Catholic mass on Sunday, and like went to some Protestant church on like Saturday or something.
That just means he's double Christian, okay?
Exactly. So anyway, so these are, I think we kind of drifted away from what we were talking about. They were talking about how history might view Blumpf, but regardless of that, like let's talk about our own opinions of Trump and how he might compare with other presidents. And I have something to say about this here, because I think that there's a particular way that one should go about like ranking presidents and political leaders in general. Obviously, this would apply outside of America as well. And I think that when people like talk about like, oh, this is something libertarians are guilty of all the time. Like they'll say Obama's the worst president ever because the deficit has increased by, X much, right? But that doesn't take into account the fact that, libertarian standards, the government in general, the state, and of course the presidency as an instrument of the state, becomes worse and worse over time. So I think how you should rank a president should be basically relative to both like the immediate alternative in the sense of who they were running against, both in the general election and the primaries, and then also their predecessor and their successor. In some ways, I think we can't quite judge Trump yet. And of course, there's other reasons why we wouldn't want to yet either. But
yeah, but so far, I think he's been a pretty good president. Best one in a good while.
So why do you like that? Why do you like him?
Well, you got the tax bill that was just passed. That's good. Included in that was the end of the individual mandate for health care, and he got rid of some of the state line stuff with health care, and that's good. You've seen a decrease in the I think you've actually seen a decrease in the number of regulations, not just a stagnation of the growth, which is what you saw under Reagan. There have been more people assigned to ICE. You see fewer people crossing the border, and that's good. He has continued he has continued his campaign work in terms of igniting this culture war against the media, and that's very exciting. And he hasn't started a war, and that's cool. So those seem like good reasons. He's also made shit libs like outrageously mad.
He's trolled libtards epic style,
and that's funny. Yes, exactly.
You stole my thing.
There's a few. Oh, sorry. Were you gonna say that?
It was. Go ahead though.
Okay, so what I was gonna say is, in terms of the regulations, at least, I think that actually is something that's kind of interesting. He had that policy, right, where in order to pass a regulation, you had to repeal two, if I'm remembering that correctly.
That's right.
Like that certainly, as a libertarian, to me, that's very exciting. But I'm not sure, whether that actually did something in practice, basically, because as I understand it, like they can just write a regulation that just covers the two things that they had to repeal and then add something else, right? Like, is there any rule on like what? How do you define one regulation?
Yeah, it's a very childlike way of doing it, to be honest. Like, just say like, don't make new regulations.
That is a potential concern. We need to look into how that worked out. Although I will say that there was a report in December that I saw that supposedly the margin had actually been much greater than that. That for every one regulation, it had been, I don't remember the exact number, but it was like over 10 regulations that were removed.
Yeah.
Which, maybe what's happening is in every regulation now they're packing in 12 times as much stuff, right? Maybe. But
Or something else could be on the regulatory side, or on the executive side. They could be repealing regulations, and then also on legislative, they're operating under that rule.
Yeah.
So I don't know.
Honestly, I'm not really sure what empirical metric we should even use to judge.
Yeah, this is kind of annoying. Like, if we could just look at if we could just run a calculator on the savings. Some people have done an analysis of stuff like that. I know Breitbart has run some stories about that throughout, of dubious, whatever credibility.
Okay, but that's the problem with this, though. Like, at least with something like overall tax burden, at least that's qualitative. But that's quantitative rather. But all this stuff is just qualitative, and it's kind of hard to weigh it against other things. But I think it's safe to say that if it made any difference at all, it probably did something good. However hard it may be to qualify exactly how good it was.
That's probably true. Can I go on my
yes,
spiel
go on your
Blumpf
spiel.
Is actually
your
fucking
spiel.
dumb and should be killed. Okay, so
sounds pretty gay.
Yeah, okay, Sean. Lay 3D chess. Okay, so I am someone who supported Trump very early on and only basically jumped ship during his appointment of the cabinet. So I feel like someone who like shielded for him through thick and thin. Like it, at this point, it's basically impossible to claim this guy is like a net good for libertarianism. Now, that's not saying that his repeal of regulations aren't good, and the tax bill wasn't good relative to what we had before. But the kind of policies as a Republican president that Trump has fielded, things like tariff increases, things like gun control, things like, this isn't just a policy proposal, intensifying the war on terror in the Middle East and also West Africa, opening the front, antagonizing North Korea, and potentially going to war with them. That's something that it's tabled, not certain, but we are in more conflicts in the third world than we were under Obama. We're bombing more people than we were under Obama. We're spending more, not necessarily under Obama as like gross, but we're up from Obama's like the last term of Obama, which makes boomers happy, but doesn't make me happy, and shouldn't make people who have to pay for that shit happy. More deficits.
Trump kept his promise to like keep the government out of their Social Security.
Yeah, exactly. Keep the government. Right. Highest spending government in history.
But to be fair, that's kind of what I was saying earlier, right? Is that this is something I read in Rothbard's critique of Ronald Reagan, right? When he was talking about, what was it, the myth of Reaganomics, right? So he didn't like the idea of comparing, I think it was national debt to GDP. But I'm not sure that I agree with Rothbard in that case. Like, I think that...
that's sort of... how
it's sort of trivial.
Rothbard in particular have a hang-up about GDP, right?
Well, okay, but it wasn't just... Yes, that's true, but he was even using, like, GNP or whatever he was using to circumvent that. That's not the particular thing I'm talking about. I'm talking about just, the general idea of government spending going up over time, and it being kind of trivial to say, like with every new government, okay, this president has spent the most that any president has ever spent. Well, yes, that's true, but that's just kind of how things are now, and I don't like it. I wish we could reverse it, but I don't think it makes sense.
By the way, it didn't used to be that way. You know that, right?
I know.
Okay, it is something to say. Like, okay. So you have this giant populist wave. We're gonna drain the swamp and get government under control. You would at least expect the stagnation of the spending, though, right? Like, it's very disappointing.
I didn't expect.
I know. Had no high hope of this big reduction in federal spending, and I said
my name there. We're gonna have to bleep that out when I edit this.
Oh my god, I'm sorry.
What's my name? Do you remember
to
my
some
name,
extent,
Adrian?
I didn't either. What? I'm sorry.
Do you remember my name?
Chucky.
Okay, that's right.
God, that's gay. You should have just gone with
Colin. All right.
Yeah, but I would say so to get back on the actual topic, though. So I think that it would be weird if we expected Trump to decrease government spending by a lot, because he didn't run a Republican campaign based on slashing foreign policy spending, military, welfare spending.
I'm sorry. Can I just butt in here? But one of the good things. One of the good things I will say about Trump is that he does seem to be leaning towards cutting more foreign aid spending, which is very good. And he's already done it with the UN and with Pakistan. So that is good. That's a very libertarian thing.
But I think we need to, when talking about his economic impact, and we're faced with these two things, where he lowered taxes, and that's good, and he's increased the deficit, and that's arguably not good. But the empirical literature on those two things don't look the same, right? Because there's a consistent finding that lower taxes longitudinally are associated with, after taxes are lowered, growth increases. The empirical relationship between debt and economic growth is extremely inconsistent, and I think it's fairly safe to say that the U.S. government, our current level of debt, it does not seem to be a strong empirical case for the idea that that's inhibiting our growth rate in any significant way.
Deficits don't matter. They're worth less than fecal matter.
Well, they don't. I mean, they matter in certain circumstances, which is when the people funding the debt lose faith in some respect. But there's no serious sign of that happening in the case of the United States. And
but we got downgraded to AA.
Yeah, and then everything's still fine.
Because that actually matters with foreign investors.
So that a comparison that Paul Krugman, everyone's favorite economist, makes a lot is that the current U.S. debt to GDP ratio is similar to what the British Empire had for like 70 years of its existence. And of course, just the actual more rigorous empirical studies on this tend to find that you have to get to a very high threshold of debt to GDP ratio before there starts to become a negative relationship between that and growth. So I think that if we have these two things, the lowering of the taxes but the increase in the debt, we have to look at that on net as a positive thing economically.
Oh, I mean, I would certainly agree. I would prefer lower taxes, even if that meant an increased deficit and increased debt, both just in terms of from a utilitarian view. I don't think it'll inhibit growth for those empirical reasons that you mentioned. And then also even from trying to be a libertarian purist about it, I would say that it's preferable that we don't steal more from people because, taxation is theft. Even if that means like the government, the state is going to go into debt.
Yes. Now, in terms of the foreign policy thing, I think it's difficult to judge because, well, he definitely hasn't started any wars, obviously, yet. There's been an increase in activities, as you mentioned, Adrian, in certain parts of the world, but it's unclear yet if those are going to have the same negative consequences as did the interventions that the previous recent presidents carried out.
Yeah, I agree with that. He is better than Bush in foreign policy, and he probably won't be worse than Bush. And so far, he's better than Obama in policy, and he may be worse than Obama, but maybe it's not that much more.
Well, see, here's the thing about that, right? Is that Trump is a high variance candidate. That's something that we need to acknowledge here when we're talking about this. Because candidates like Bush and Obama, presidents like Bush and Obama, right? They had an actual doctrine they were following, which was neoconservatism, roughly. And that involved a lot of long-term, small-scale interventions in third-world countries, eternally chasing down some terrorist or whatever they want to call it, insurgents, etc., forever. It's kind of funny, we don't have wars anymore. We just have operations, endless and endless operations. So that's fine. And Trump shifted the paradigm a bit because he has no doctrine. He just kind of does whatever, basically, right? Like he sent those cruise missiles, or what were they, Tomahawks, whatever they were.
Yeah, they were cruise missiles.
Yeah, Tomahawk cruise. That's the same thing.
Okay, pedophile.
Some military fucking autiste is gonna roast me if they ever listen to
this. Yeah, fucking Strash.
Yeah, Strash. Okay. Anyway, so he might do that one day when he feels like it, or when his advisor tells him to, and then when a different advisor tells him something different, he'll behave differently. Right? Like we've sent the fleet to intimidate and antagonize North Korea. That could escalate, right? That's an important thing to say, is that I think that because Trump is not following the standard neocon doctrine and not following any doctrine, in fact, he has a lower chance of doing the everyday bad shit that people like Bush and Obama would do. But he has a higher chance of doing really bad shit that Bush and Obama would not do, such as invading North Korea.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Now, one interesting question, though, is whether or not he would have a higher probability of doing really bad shit that Hillary Clinton would do. And this is going to depend on how seriously you take her anti-Russia rhetoric. Right, because obviously if Hillary Clinton did the things she said she was going to do, and they played out in the bad way, that would be much worse than going to North Korea.
Are you talking about the no-fly zone over Syria?
Yeah, if we actually if now we don't know that this would play out this way, but if we did that and the Russians came there and we shot down a bunch of Russian airplanes and committed an act of aggressive war against Russians, that would obviously have been roughly the worst foreign policy thing the United States could do.
Yeah, that very well could have happened. Although I'm not sure. I tend to think that Russia and the U.S. probably.
Yeah, that seems unlikely because if we had done that, Russia presumably would have stopped sending planes there.
Yes, it likely would have been.
Yeah, rationally, we probably wouldn't have gone to nuclear.
We are comparing this probability to the probability of Trump actually doing something in North Korea, and that's very hard to get a hold of as well because we're mainly basing this off of things he says, and Trump is a notoriously dishonest person, right? Who has a lot of bluster. So I don't know, it's a very ambiguous probability, the actual chance that he's going to do something in North Korea.
Well, I think part of what makes it so ambiguous, as you said, is that
goddamn
that Trump and Clinton both lie a lot, but they lie in very different ways, right? Like Clinton, lies in the way that politicians normally lie, which is for tactical, calculated reasons, oh, I want to appeal to this demographic so they'll vote for me, etc. But Trump just kind of says random stuff. It almost seems kind of like how I was talking about how he has random policies. His what his rhetoric kind of mirrors that.
I mean, not only does he lie in a way that is not consistently tactical, but also Hillary Clinton, when she lies, there are things that at least a significant proportion of people could plausibly believe what she is saying, often just because they're ignorant and don't know what she's talking about. But Trump will lie about things that just no rational person could possibly believe. Right? He's claimed that when he talked about the Muslim ban, he had Muslims calling him, telling him it was a great thing. No one believes that happened. Or just recently when he was like, I can't believe that cop didn't go into that school. If I was there, even if I didn't have a weapon, I would have gone in. No one thinks that Trump would have actually done that. That's implausible at the level that even people who support him know that he is obviously just not telling the truth.
I mean, I think I saw some Trumpanzees on Facebook who posted stuff like, oh, well, one time Trump intervened in some fight in New York City or something, so clearly he would have totally read.
Yes, I saw that too. Yeah,
maybe I'm not.
He was in his limo, and he had his limo driver drive up during a robbery, and the robber ran away, and that was a story in the 90s. So obviously he would have ran in where there was an active shooter shooting thousands of rounds into people.
He would have hit him with a chair and shaved his head.
But that's different. When Hillary Clinton says, "Oh, I remember when the helicopter was going down and the bullets were coming past me," right? If you don't know anything about that,
under
you could
sniper fire in Bosnia.
But Trump, yeah, I mean, maybe there is a small group of people who believe the ridiculous things that Trump says, but it's a very small number of people. Yeah. Hopefully,
Russian trolls.
Well, I don't know. Even hopefully, maybe it would be a good thing if he. I mean, that would imply some level of stupidity upon people, but.
Well, I mean, there's relative levels of things people will believe, even though they should know better. So.
Yeah, this conversation is now taking a really weird direction. Gun control. That was another thing. That was another thing that you brought up, Adrian. And if he does, so he, if I am not mistaken, he did some executive action by which he's banned bump stocks, which I guess are some device that you use to turn semi-automatic guns into something
that's right. They manipulate
automatic weapon.
Yeah, they manipulate trigger pull to have a higher rate of fire.
It's basically the equivalent of, you know how you'd go into GameStop when you were a kid and you could buy a controller that would allow you to press the trigger faster so you could win a game easily? It's like that, except real.
Yeah.
But okay, so there's that, and that's something he actually did. And intuitively, that seems like it's probably a good idea to me. Now, I know that you two are very libertarian, and so we'll oppose it on libertarian grounds. It's
okay. Here's the thing. I don't think
recently has said things right that sound a little scarier, but he hasn't actually done anything, and he has a history of saying bad policy ideas that he then does not do.
Yeah, but also he has done bad policies before.
Yeah, I mean he's a shit talker, but he also is on occasion a shit doer.
If I could just say about the bump stocks.
Yes, bump stocks.
Now, I don't necessarily think. I mean, first of all, bump stocks are not a useful modification to a firearm unless you want to enjoy yourself and have the joy of firing full auto without buying an extremely expensive full auto weapon on the market. They are not useful for mass shootings. They are not useful for murder in general. They're very inaccurate.
Used in a small
They're also
percentage
relatively easy to make, too. You can easily 3D print something or do something in a shop that would do the exact same thing. It's not too hard. It's actually not too hard to modify a semi-automatic natively to create a machine gun. That's illegal.
Okay.
Bump stocks are legal because they aren't very useful at killing people. So the bump stock, I mean, here's the thing.
Adrian coming out with the Turning Point USA talking points.
Oh my god.
Well, if I understand correctly, the impetus behind banning the bump stock was that one was used in that Las Vegas shooting recently.
I do not know for sure, and I'm not sure.
But you know as well as we do, of course, that even if that is the case, that's a very bad reason to ban something, right? Like, for example, if someone was struck by lightning, that's a tragedy, and maybe you could, decrease the number of people who are struck by lightning by, federal funding for like installing lightning rods in places so that the lightning hits the rods instead of people. But that wouldn't be a good idea, right? In this case, it would just be a bad idea because of the investment wouldn't be worth it. But in the case of banning bump stocks, I think that the obvious case here for someone who is a libertarian is just that there should be a general presumption against banning something, right? And you can make an argument that, although I am generally not sympathetic to these kind of arguments, but if you wanted to say like, okay, listen, normally I wouldn't like to ban something, but this is just so bad we have to ban it. But it's not so bad, right? Like, there's not even good evidence to suggest that the murder rate would be substantially decreased by the banning of bump stocks. It's literally just like a way to, take advantage of historical normies, right?
Well, I would say that so. It's hard. The empirical literature on gun regulations and crime is complicated and inconsistent. But it seems, my impression though, is that gun regulations, which significantly hamper the number of guns in the population, seem to be pretty ineffective at decreasing actual homicide rates. But regulations which inhibit the right, like gun rights, in other ways, on average, and this is a very large category of regulations, but that's one of the problems is that these regulations are fairly idiosyncratic across countries from what I can tell. But on average, those do tend to have a positive effect on crime. I don't know if the bump stock, like you'd have to do a bunch of research on the bump stock in particular
from what
to know
I've
if that
seen,
would be one of those regulations.
It seems
probably.
that bump stocks are used in like a minuscule percentage of like violent crime.
Well, you have to compare. It would be a cost-benefit thing, right? So that this many people are going to be killed because of the bump stock, and this is the cost. These are the other good uses of a bump stock, which Adrian has implied actually there basically are none. So that would seem intuitively to be something you would say in favor of not allowing people to have it.
What? Wait. Why would that be an argument against it? Or did you do a double negative?
The idea is that banning things is not as bad if those things are not very useful in the first place.
They're useful because they're fun and they don't actually like. I mean, here's the thing. There probably would have been a marginal. I mean, listen. If a bump stock was used in Las Vegas, which is not clear, because that is like nothing about that has been released really. If that was true, right? I doubt, one, that there would have been too many more casualties in like the 45 minutes of fire upon the concert. And two, that the guy wouldn't have been able to modify the semi-automatic to fire accurately versus inaccurately. Semi-automatic or full automatic fire. which the bump stock would not have allowed him to do.
The argument that I've heard about this is that, assuming that Paddock was using a bump stock when he was shooting at the, what was it? What kind of concert was it? Some country music or something? Whatever.
Country music concert.
During the Day of Retribution. Was that basically, assuming he was using a bump stock, that may have actually decreased the casualties because he couldn't aim properly. Now, I don't know enough about guns to know if that's at all even true. Or if
it's absolutely true. If you've ever seen, you can just look on YouTube, someone firing a bump stock. The recoil is like very large, and because the shooter doesn't hold the gun as firm, because there's an attachment from the stock to the trigger that basically bumps it back and forth. So it's basically impossible to hold it still enough to get a good sight picture.
So the argument would be that if you were actually looking to commit a mass shooting, a bump stock wouldn't help you kill a lot more people. But if you're just having fun fucking around at the range, a bump stock could allow you to experience the joy of automatic fire.
God, that sounds like a fucking commercial.
The joy.
I mean, if that is an accurate depiction, if Adrian's summary of the bump stock is accurate, then yeah, that sounds like a bad idea.
I would encourage you guys to watch some videos on bump stocks. It's very clearly a very shaky but fun attachment.
So I would also say, though, that the banning of the bump stock, let's say it is a bad thing, which it sounds like it might be. It still is not a super important gun regulation in that it is not chipping away at the basic, right to have guns and the usefulness of that. So that
I agree with that, yeah.
This would be like a slight negative thing about Trump, I think, rather than a big deal.
Yeah,
I mean obviously, done is obviously.
Yeah. I don't want to crucify Trump just because of the bump stock ban. I'm very angry that he's, for example, talking about making the background checks more stringent. Also, talking about eroding due process when it comes to taking guns from people. And thirdly, if you guys haven't seen, he talked about the effect that violent video games might be having.
Yes, I did see that. That's another extremely boomerish thing.
Yes, and today he talked to video game executives.
Oh my fucking god! Yeah.
Yes, these are all negative things.
That's what we call el atrocidad. No, but
okay. Well, some of those things. So it's been some years since I read this, but if I remember right, improved background checks do seem to have a good effect on homicide. Like that, as I recollect, it's a good thing.
It depends on what they are, right? Moving it to 21, I don't like. One, it doesn't affect me, and two, it might actually have good effects because older people are more mature and less likely to engage in this kind of violence, especially.
Well, I would push back somewhat against that, though, in that. So we need to look at a very important thing whenever you're talking about a group that is more likely to commit a crime, is to look at the degree to which they are also more likely to be a victim of that crime, right? So that if 18 to 21-year-olds are more likely to commit violent crimes, but also, and I don't know if this is true, but are also much more likely to be the victims of violent crimes, then it may be that by taking their guns away, you're taking more guns away from victims than from perpetrators, depending on how the relative degree of disproportionality works out.
I'm not sure how that could not be the case in terms of under 18 to 21-year-olds being more likely to be victims of crime, right? Because just think about, hood
niggas.
Yeah, hood niggas, right?
I mean, that is certainly the case with mental illness, which is something people talk about sometimes, is stopping people with a recorded mental illness from getting guns because they're more likely to be the perpetrators. But they are disproportionately more likely to be perpetrators. But it is even more true that they are disproportionately likely to be the victims of violent crime.
Yes, Ryan Falk actually made a good point about that as well, in terms of how there's a long history of mental illness being used politically, right? And
yeah, but that's actually aside what Sean is saying, because I think Sean makes something very important that I'm going to use in the future, which is that, this is a good way to think about this kind of thing, right? It's not just perpetrators, it's victims, and mentally ill people are way more likely to be victims of crime or whatever violence than perpetrators. So it absolutely makes sense to protect their right to self-defense, right?
Sure. Yes. I mean, yeah. Taking away guns from mentally ill. Mentally ill is bad. I mean, I'm pretty Zaz-pilled on this.
Well, you don't even have to be Zaz-pilled. Like, I mean, yeah, I was too, but
yeah,
like
this
is a good rhetorical argument.
Yes, that's
true.
I don't think there's anything about the way that we currently use the notion of mental illness which would be used in an especially political way.
Well, I mean, Ryan Falk's example was
oh God, we're gonna get me to argue something Ryan said.
Okay. You don't. If you don't want to argue exactly with that, then that's fine. All right.
Right. Dinesh D'Souza
redacted.
Would have been potentially mentally ill by some judges.
Well, right. The judge ordered him to seek psychiatric evaluation, and obviously it's because he was like a conservatard. Moreover, he also talked about there's like a growing movement in psychiatry to label racism a mental illness.
Do you remember Nick used to probe his psychologist about race realism? And they always had weird answers.
That's really weird.
Yeah, they would say like, "Oh, why do you think that?" And he like very like straightforward. It's like, "Well, this is the data. This is blah blah blah." And they, I mean, to some extent, I sort of like get it, like that they, they're professionals and they wanna like make progress on their client. But it just seemed very weird that like they never really took him seriously in terms of like the data itself. They just kind of kept like dodging it and like making it about him.
Well, I think that I don't know about the D'Souza thing, and that sounds. I just don't know the details of the D'Souza thing. In terms of the racism thing, so it's important to note that the way the American psychiatric and counseling community works today is that a set of symptoms is not going to be classified as a mental illness unless you're causing significant harm to yourself that compels you to want to change the behavior, or you break laws and that the government demands that you change the behavior. But if you are someone, I mean, to take a very common example, there are many people with OCD who, the way psychologists use the term now, are not mentally ill because their OCD manifests in a way that is not causing dysfunction in their life that they want to change. And I can't imagine they would change that very basic criteria of mental illness in order to call all racists mentally ill. Right, but and there are plausible circumstances in which, like, an extreme hatred of an outgroup can cause psychological dysfunction that someone might want to change, and there are also obviously instances in which that can lead to violent crime, in which case the state might mandate it be changed.
Yeah. So it sounds like you're kind of arguing against your own point there.
Well, no. I mean, if we're talking about the subset of people that commit violent crimes due to their political views, it's not obvious to me that it would be a bad idea to try to get them to calm down with respect to some of those political views.
Well, I mean, you can argue about whether that would be a bad idea in itself, but that's clearly related to what we were talking about, right? Which was like politicization, right, of mental illness.
I guess it depends on how you. Well, okay, there are two things. One, I don't know if that's politicization or not.
Maybe not in itself, right? But it's clearly related to that, right? In that those two things would trend together. Like, for example, suppose that the media starts talking a lot about, a few storm fags who go around like killing black people or something. I don't know how common that is, but suppose that the media like fixates on that, and then they get defined as mentally ill and racist, and then that moves the criteria for mental illness, or maybe they wouldn't even be explicitly defined as mentally ill, but by being associated with it, like somehow then the gun laws could change even more now that we've conceded that mentally ill people are not allowed to own guns. Maybe now people who are almost mentally ill wouldn't be allowed to own guns either,
That's okay. That's two different steps, though.
Yes, it is.
So my point. So in a sense, it would be related to politics. But my point is just that even if we did that, I don't think that it would lead to huge numbers of conservatives not being allowed to own firearms, because it would only apply to the people that are actually designated as mentally ill. Unless if they did something broader than that. And to be clear, again, I don't even agree with doing it to mentally ill people for another reason. But if it was even broader than that, then obviously that would become just increasingly problematic. So
we're in agreement, basically. I think that
Blumpf is bad.
That Elliot Rodger has an inalienable right to own guns.
I guess one thing to say though, no, not Elliot Rodger.
Yes,
and I would
Elliot Rodger. Yes,
Saint Roger.
Kappa autists should
I do not
allowed
allow
to own McNukes and machine guns. I agree. But
one thing though that occurs to me is that, so one brief other thing about the psychiatry thing is that psychiatrists are also, we heard a lot of stories about a year ago about them treating tons of people for being upset about Trump.
Yes.
Right. So there's that. But also in terms of Elliot Rodger, I think there would be a better case to be made if you specified particular kinds of mental illness.
If you're an incel,
data about this, but if someone proposed that people who have been diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder should have more stringent criterion for the circumstances in which they can have guns, like that seems intuitively plausible to me. Although, as I say, you would need data on that.
Well, the thing about that is that's kind of weird, right? Because generally people who are diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder, like I feel like most of the time it's because they committed a crime or something, and then like a
that is often true.
Yeah.
Or they're kids. And they're fucking up in school.
Exactly. So I don't know how much of a difference that would actually make. But I want to bring the conversation back to Blumpf in general, because remember, that's what we're supposed to be talking about as a broader topic.
I mean, in theory, we're supposed to be talking about mini presidents.
No,
but
we've abandoned that. We've abandoned that.
Part two.
That's next episode. So some other things that he's done. We talked about, let's see, the Korean cage rattling, bog rattling.
I was gonna say that.
Roho the rattling bog. Okay. We talked about that. We talked about other foreign policy stuff with regard to like Africa and Syria. We also discussed his. I don't know. Did we get into his trade policy? That's an interesting thing, right? Is that his rhetoric?
Yeah, tariffs are bad. Next question.
Well, okay, his rhetoric coming into the presidency, right, was extremely bad on trade, right? He was talking about pulling out of NAFTA. I know, Adrian, you might be sympathetic to pulling out of NAFTA because it's like globalist or whatever. But I, for one, will take reductions in taxes where I can get them, even if it comes with a bunch of weird, like, multinational.
I mean, I do too. I just don't know if it actually rounds out.
Okay, well, we can talk about that later. But in terms of Trump's actual policies, it seems as though when he first got into office, he wasn't closely following a lot of that rhetoric on trade, right? Because he had that bizarre conversation with like the Mexican president, Enrique Peña Nieto, where he said like, "Oh, we worked it out. It's great. We're not going to leave NAFTA," right? That was extremely strange. So reversed on that, which was good. I liked that. But now it seems like he's starting to really get serious about the anti-trade stuff again with this steel tariff. I think it was he just passed steel and aluminum. And he also said that trade wars are good, which I don't know how much consequence that's going to have, but
which is fucking retarded.
Yes, that's obviously retarded.
Yeah, the things he's choosing to tariff seem strange as well, because they're all like raw materials, right, that are used to produce lots of final products in the United States, which intuitively would be the last thing in the world you would want to tariff. So it seems bad. Hopefully he won't do much in that area, though. I don't. Maybe you guys can clear this up for me, because I don't fully understand this. So he announced recently that he wanted to do a 25% tariff on steel, and some news organizations are reporting it as if he's done that somehow. And I'm confused, because my impression. Can he somehow enact short-term tariffs without the Congress?
I believe
the executive branch does have discretion.
He can, but he has not.
Okay. So that was unclear to me based on
that's another weird thing, right? This reminds me of the whole like transgender in the military thing. That was just something Trump bizarrely like tweeted. No trannies in the military. And then like, okay, is this a law, right? Like I even remember there were reports of there were reports of like military people saying, okay, I don't know what to do now. Is this the policy? Like
oh my god.
Because Trump has the authority. I think this is the case
with definitely does.
With both tariffs and that he can do that. This might even be an interesting thing where we're seeing a new paradigm here, right? Because I'm assuming, I don't know a lot about this, but I'm assuming that traditionally for a president to use executive authority to affect policy, they would do it through whatever the formal channels that are set up are. But, given that it really is at his executive discretion, I think he can kind of just say something and then have his like underlings will interpret, his boomer posting.
His doctrine.
They'll interpret his boomer posting and they'll make policy based on that, right? Because they have the authority to act as though the president was saying something. I don't think the president needs to like sign a tariff. I think his office can do it.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
Well, hopefully, we'll see. He's in the last week, he's gone in a bad direction in terms of trade and guns.
Yeah.
So hopefully this is just a bad week or two, and it'll turn around. See.
As far as before that, though, I would say Trump certainly didn't live up to the expectations of a lot of libertarians who were supporting him. Although I think that in general, he's probably a modestly good president in terms of like that standard I was talking about before. He was probably better than Hillary Clinton in some important ways. Although, again, there is also the potential for him to be worse than Clinton in some dramatic ways.
Which have not been realized.
Yes, which have not been realized.
And there were possibilities of Clinton being dramatically worse.
Yes, but let's not equivocate here. Like, Trump is the higher variance candidate. Can we agree to that?
There's a sense in which that is true, but it is also important to distinguish between things that Trump in office has suggested are on the table and things that Hillary Clinton just said she was going to do.
Yeah, I guess we have to use a bit of big brain Bayesian reasoning here in terms of like what is the chance that the U.S. would have actually gone to war with Russia, and we can assume the probability is a bit higher given that Clinton would say like, oh, I'm going to do the no-fly zone, but I feel like a lot of times stuff like that doesn't actually materialize because Clinton, as I was talking about before, knows what she's doing in terms of lying both on the campaign trail and in terms of just lying to the public regularly, whereas Trump, I feel like, is literally just an insane guy who if he lies, it's just like, well, not insane, but a normie basically.
Normies are crazy.
Yeah, I just don't think we have a good sense of either probabilities because we compare the probability, how much the probability of going to Russia is raised by having Clinton in office versus Trump, and how much the probability of going to war with North Korea is raised by Trump being in office as opposed to Hillary Clinton, and then weight that by the difference in badness between going to war with Russia and going to war with North Korea, which are very different.
Well, you're not even accounting for, though, the probability that we would go to war with Russia under Trump. Right.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. We could do this. Yeah. Okay. This is my point. This would be very complicated, and it's not. And we couldn't actually do it. And if we did do it, it's not clear to me who would actually look worse.
In terms of like the mean, I think that if we're just talking about whether we're talking about foreign policy alone or just policy in general, I think the mean would find.
No, I'm talking about foreign policy specific in terms of like just general policy. And I think it's very clear that Trump is better than would have been.
But yeah, in terms of foreign policy, I think that the mean would find Trump better than Clinton because Trump was relatively good for a Republican on foreign policy and for a Democrat, obviously, too. I think that we should acknowledge that Trump does have a higher variance. That's just my point.
Yeah, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the really bad outcomes are more probable with him. It depends on how. I mean, if we're conceptualizing it this way, it depends on the distance between the means.
Okay, so
and the size of the difference in variance.
Now we're getting into like statistical. But also, I'm
curious as if you would say if this is a symmetrical distribution, would you say that Trump is also more likely to do really, really good things in the way that he's more likely to do really, really bad things Now, I think everyone would have said that going into the Trump administration, but a year and whatever into it, do you think that's true?
More likely than Clinton, yes.
I don't. It's very hard. What would be the really good thing Trump would do? Like,
one.
Yes, just taking a bunch of stuff out of various parts of the world.
I mean, I would say though that it's not symmetrical in terms of like I think that Trump probably is more likely to do really bad things than to do really good things.
Yes. The same. I guess the same is true of Clinton. Neither distribution would really look symmetrical.
Hey guys, this is Chucky R. Law. Sorry to cut this off so abruptly, but we're out of time for today. We'll be back in 2 weeks. We're going to try to make this a bi-weekly thing. In the meantime, be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel, and hopefully we'll also have this on iTunes soon. If you want to send us an email to be read on the show, we're at cursediscussions@gmail.com. Thanks for listening.
Just 一份圣诞节，祝我祝愿。